Thunder rolled across the Montana plains as lightning split the black sky above Devil's Creek. Jonas McCready sat hunched over his kitchen table, cleaning his Winchester by lamplight. At 43, his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the whiskey that dulled the ache in his joints. The storm outside matched the tempest that had raged in his chest for the past 4 years, since Martha's fever took her. The cabin felt too large without her laughter echoing from its corners. Her rocking chair sat empty by the cold hearth, gathering dust like the memories he couldn't bring himself to disturb. Jonas had built this place with his own hands, 20 miles from the nearest settlement of Copper Falls, where a man could live without questions or prying eyes. A sharp crack of thunder shook the windows, followed by something else. A sound that made Jonas freeze mid-motion, a woman's voice, crying out against the storm. He set down the rifle and moved to the window, peering through rain-streaked glass. Lightning illuminated the fence line where his property met the open range. There, collapsed against the wooden posts, was a figure in torn calico dress, dark hair plastered to her skull by the driving rain. Jonas grabbed his coat and rifle, stepping into the storm's fury. The woman looked up as his lantern light fell across her face. Young, maybe 25, with eyes wide with terror. "Please," she gasped through chattering teeth. "Don't let them find me." "Who's after you?" Jonas asked, scanning the darkness beyond his land. "My husband," she whispered. "He'll kill me if he finds me here." Jonas hesitated. He'd spent 4 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, but the woman was half frozen, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. Whatever her story, she wouldn't survive the night without shelter. "Come on," he said, lifting her to her feet. "Get you inside before you catch your death." Her name was Sarah Collins, and she'd been running for 2 days through the wilderness. As she sat wrapped in Martha's old quilt before the fireplace, warming her hands around a cup of coffee, she told her story in fragments. "Thomas owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties, she said, her voice hollow. "Owns the sheriff, too, and half the businesses in Copper Falls. When I married him, I thought I was blessed." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I learned different soon enough." Jonas had seen the bruises on her wrists, the older scars that spoke of systematic cruelty. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" "Where would I go?" "Thomas made sure everyone knew I was his property. Told them I was prone to hysteria, to making up stories." She pulled the quilt tighter. "2 nights ago he said he was done with me, that accidents happen to hysterical wives." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jonas poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, his mind working through the complications this woman represented. Thomas Collins was indeed powerful, with influence that reached far beyond Copper Falls. But Jonas McCready had been a lawman once, before Martha, before the solitude. He recognized the look in Sarah's eyes, the same desperate hope he'd seen in too many victims over the years. "You can stay until the storm passes," he said finally. "Then I'll help you get somewhere safe." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you. I promise I won't be any trouble." But trouble, Jonas reflected as he banked the fire, had a way of finding a man whether he invited it or not. Dawn brought clear skies and the sound of approaching riders. Jonas counted 6 men from his window, led by Sheriff Ben Crawford, a man whose loyalty could be bought and sold like cattle. Behind him rode Thomas Collins himself, a bull of a man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence. "Sarah," Jonas called softly. "They're here." Her face went white. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin," she whispered urgently. "I saw it last night." Jonas nodded, helping her through the rear door. The cellar was small, but well concealed beneath a false floor. "Stay quiet until I come for you," he instructed. Crawford's voice boomed across the yard. "McCready, come on out, we need to talk." Jonas stepped onto his porch, Winchester cradled casually in his arms. "Sheriff? Mr. Collins? What brings you to my land?" "Looking for my wife," Collins said, his voice deceptively calm. "She's not well, prone to wandering. Thought she might have come this way." Haven't seen anyone, Jonas replied evenly. Been alone since the storm hit. Crawford's eyes narrowed. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough. I do mind. Jonas's grip tightened on his rifle. This is private property, Sheriff. Unless you've got a warrant, you can state your business and move on. Collins's facade cracked. Listen, McCready. I know she's here. Tracked her to your fence line. Now you can hand her over peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way. Don't know what you're talking about, Jonas said. But you're welcome to search the open range. Just stay off my land while you do it. For a moment, tension hung thick as the morning air. Then Collins smiled, a predator's expression that never reached his eyes. You're making a mistake, McCready. I've got a long memory. They rode off, but Jonas knew they'd be back. Men like Collins didn't accept defeat easily. He waited until the dust settled before retrieving Sarah from the cellar. He won't give up, she said, fear evident in her voice. Thomas always gets what he wants. Jonas studied her face, seeing not just terror but determination. Then we need to make sure he doesn't get you. Over the next 2 days, Jonas learned more about Sarah Collins. She'd been a school teacher in Denver before her marriage, educated and strong-willed until systematic abuse had broken her spirit. But that spirit wasn't dead, only dormant. I kept a journal, she told him on the second evening, hidden in our bedroom. Everything Thomas did, every threat he made, evidence of his business dealings with outlaws, the money he's stolen from the territory. Where is it now? Still there, far as I know. But getting it would mean going back. She shuddered. I can't face that house again. Jonas considered this. Evidence of Collins's crimes could end his reign of terror, but retrieving it would be dangerous. The man had too many allies, too much power. That night, as Sarah slept on Martha's old bed, and Jonas kept watch from his chair, he found himself thinking about choices. 4 years ago, he'd chosen solitude over justice, isolation over involvement. It had seemed easier then, but now he had a chance to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Dawn's light was just touching the horizon when Jonas made his decision. He woke Sarah gently. That journal, he said. Where exactly did you hide it? Sarah's eyes widened. You can't be serious. It's too dangerous. Sometimes, danger is the price of doing what's right. Jonas checked his weapons, the familiar weight of justice settling on his shoulders. Stay here. Keep the rifle close. Jonas, please. He turned at the door. A man can't run from his conscience forever. I learned that the hard way. The Collins Ranch sprawled across a valley 20 miles south, a monument to wealth built on others' suffering. Jonas approached carefully, using his knowledge of such places to avoid the hands who worked the outer pastures. The main house stood empty in the early morning light. Collins had likely taken most of his men to continue searching for Sarah. Jonas slipped through a rear window, moving quickly through rooms decorated with luxury bought with blood money. The bedroom was on the second floor, dominated by a massive bed and heavy furniture. Sarah had described the hiding place well, behind a loose board near the window. The journal was there, wrapped in oilcloth, its pages filled with Sarah's careful handwriting. Names, dates, amounts, a complete record of Collins's criminal empire. As Jonas tucked it into his coat, footsteps sounded on the stairs below. Collins's voice carried through the house. Check every room. If she came back here, I want to know. Jonas considered his options. The window offered escape, but voices in the yard suggested men positioned outside. The front stairs were the only way down, and Collins was between him and freedom. Sometimes, he reflected, the direct approach was best. Jonas descended the stairs with purpose, his Colt drawn but held low. Collins waited in the main room, flanked by 2 hired guns, men whose faces belonged on wanted posters. Well, Collins said, his voice deadly calm. Jonas McCready. Come calling at last. Come for what's mine, Jonas replied evenly. "Nothing here belongs to you, old man." Collins nodded to his men. "Kill him." The gunfight was brief and decisive. Jonas's years as a lawman served him well. His first shot dropped the gunman on the left. His second caught the other, before the man could clear leather. Collins reached for his weapon but found himself staring down the barrel of Jonas's Colt. "It's over, Collins," Jonas said. "The journal, the evidence, it all ends here." Collins's face twisted with rage. "You think that matters? I own this territory, every judge, every official. They're all in my pocket." "Maybe so. But there's always a higher authority." Jonas's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "And sometimes justice comes from unexpected places." The sound of approaching horses filled the air. Through the window, Jonas could see riders, not Collins's men, but federal marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Collins's face drained of color. "How did they—" "Turns out your wife wasn't the only one keeping records," Jonas said. "Sent word to Denver 2 days ago. Sometimes the law reaches farther than local corruption. The arrest of Thomas Collins sent shockwaves through 3 counties. His criminal empire crumbled as associates fled or turned evidence to save themselves. Sarah's journal proved instrumental in the federal case, providing evidence of crimes that reached from cattle, rustling to murder." Jonas stood on his porch 2 weeks later, watching Sarah prepare for her journey to California, where her sister waited with a new life free from the shadows of the past. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, adjusting the traveling dress that replaced her torn calico. "No need," Jonas replied. "Sometimes we all need someone willing to stand between us and the darkness." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "What will you do now?" Jonas looked out across his land, at the fence line where she'd first appeared during that terrible storm. The cabin behind him no longer felt too large, the silence no longer oppressive. "Think I might ride into Copper Falls tomorrow," he said. "See if they need a sheriff. Been hiding from the world long enough." Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them. Martha would be proud. As the stage disappeared into the distance, Jonas felt something shift inside his chest. The weight of 4 years' grief remained, but it no longer crushed him. Some promises, he realized, weren't meant to be kept in solitude. That evening he sat in Martha's rocking chair for the first time since her death, watching the sun set over Devil's Creek. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. The stranger at his fence had given him more than he'd given her. The chance to be the man Martha had always believed him to be. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, but this time it sounded like promise rather than threat. 3 months had passed since Sarah's departure, when Jonas McCready pinned the sheriff's badge to his vest for the first time in 8 years. The weight of it felt familiar, yet foreign, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit. Copper Falls had changed in the years since Collins's arrest. The fear that had hung over the town like a shroud was slowly lifting, but scars remained. Jonas's first official act was to clean house. Crawford's deputies, those who hadn't fled with their former boss, found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their past loyalties. Most resigned rather than face federal investigation. The jail cells that had once held Collins' enemies now housed rustlers and claim jumpers, men whose crimes were honest in their dishonesty. Sheriff McCready? The voice belonged to Margaret Henley, the schoolteacher who had taken over Sarah's intended position. A woman of perhaps 30, with steel-gray eyes and a spine that wouldn't bend for man nor devil. "I need to speak with you about the widow Carson." Jonas looked up from the stack of wanted posters he'd been sorting. "What about her?" "She's been having trouble with the Brennan boys. They've been riding through her property, tearing down fences, scaring her livestock." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Yesterday they cornered her in town, made some unseemly suggestions about her circumstances. The Brennan brothers, Sean, Patrick, and young Danny, were the kind of men who mistook size for strength and intimidation for respect. Their father had owned a small spread east of town before drink and gambling debts forced him to sell to Collins. The sons had stayed on as hired guns, and Collins's fall hadn't improved their character. "I'll have a word with them," Jonas said, reaching for his hat. A word might not be enough. Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Carson is frightened, and she has reason to be. These aren't pranks, Sheriff. This is systematic harassment." Jonas studied the schoolteacher's face, recognizing something of Sarah's determined spirit in her features. "You have a suggestion, Miss Henley?" "I think it's time Copper Falls showed the Brennan boys that the old ways are finished. That women in this town have protection under the law." That afternoon, Jonas found the three Brennan brothers at Murphy's saloon, their voices loud with whiskey and bravado. Sean, the eldest, was regaling the sparse crowd with a detailed account of his encounter with Widow Carson. "Should have seen her face," he laughed, gesturing with his bottle. "Like a rabbit caught in a snare. Won't be so high and mighty when she realizes she needs a man's protection in this country." Jonas's entrance silenced the room. The Brennan boys turned as one, their expressions shifting from amusement to wariness. "Sean," Jonas said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge, "you and your brothers. Outside. Now." "We ain't done nothing wrong," Patrick protested, though his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "Outside," Jonas repeated, his tone brooking no argument. The street was empty except for a few curious onlookers who scattered as the confrontation moved outdoors. The three brothers ranged themselves across from Jonas, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Heard you boys have been bothering Widow Carson," Jonas said. Sean's face flushed red. "Free country, Sheriff. Man can ride where he pleases. Not when he's trespassing on private property. Not when he's making threats." "Who says we made threats?" Danny, the youngest, stepped forward with the swagger of youth and foolishness. "That widow's word against ours." Jonas's hand rested casually on his gun butt, but his eyes were steel. "I'm telling you once. Stay away from the Carson place. Stay away from Widow Carson. Next time I hear differently, there'll be consequences." Sean laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "You're one man, McCready. Getting old, too. Maybe it's time you learned that Collins ain't the only one with friends in this territory." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Jonas felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same clarity that had served him well in his lawman days. Some men only understood one language. "You threatening an officer of the law, Sean?" "Just stating facts." Sean's hand closed around his pistol grip. "Accidents happen to sheriffs who stick their noses where they don't belong." The draw was simultaneous, but Jonas's years of experience showed. His Colt cleared leather a heartbeat before Sean's, the shot echoing off the false-fronted buildings that lined the street. Sean Brennan staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his unfired weapon falling to the dust. Patrick and Danny froze, their own guns half drawn, suddenly aware they were facing a man who'd survived because he was faster and deadlier than those who'd tried to kill him. "Anyone else want to discuss facts?" Jonas asked, his smoking Colt held steady. The brothers helped Sean to his feet, blood seeping between his fingers. The fight had gone out of them as quickly as it had flared. "This ain't over," Patrick muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Jonas replied firmly. "It's over, or next time I won't aim for the shoulder." Dr. Peterson, summoned by the gunshot, tended to Sean's wound while Jonas watched from the porch of his office. The brothers departed town within the hour, their belongings hastily packed, their threats forgotten in the face of superior firepower. Margaret Henley appeared at Jonas's side as the dust settled. "Will they be back?" she asked. "Maybe. But not for Mrs. Carson." Jonas holstered his weapon. "Word will spread. Sometimes a man has to make examples." "Is that what you did in your lawman days? Made examples?" Jonas considered the question. "Sometimes. But I was younger then, angrier. Thought the world was divided into good men and bad men with nothing in between." He glanced at her, Experience teaches you it's more complicated than that. And now? Now I think there are people worth protecting and people who prey on them. The rest is just details. Margaret nodded approvingly. Mrs. Carson will be relieved. She's been talking about leaving town, selling her place for whatever she could get. Tell her she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. As evening approached, Jonas made his rounds through Copper Falls, checking doors and windows, speaking with shopkeepers and residents. The town was slowly returning to normal life, but vigilance remained necessary. Men like Collins might be gone, but the conditions that allowed them to flourish could return if good people became complacent. At the edge of town, he encountered a familiar figure, Charlie Two Horses, a half-breed scout who'd worked occasionally for the army. Charlie had been one of the few men in the territory who'd never bent the knee to Collins, preferring to spend his time in the wilderness rather than compromise his principles. "Heard gunfire earlier," Charlie said, falling into step beside Jonas. "Brennan boys decided to test their luck." "Didn't work out well for them." Charlie grunted approvingly. "Good. They've been terrorizing folks for months. About time someone called their hand." They walked in companionable silence for a while before Charlie spoke again. "You settling into the job?" Jonas considered the question. "Still feels strange, wearing a badge again. But it's good work, necessary work. Different from your ranch, different responsibilities. At the ranch, I only had to answer to myself. Here, I answer to the whole town." Jonas paused. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm too set in my ways for this kind of work." "Man's never too old to do right," Charlie observed, "though it gets harder as you get more to lose." The comment struck home. Jonas had indeed found things worth protecting again. Not just his own peace of mind, but the safety and security of people who depended on him. It was both burden and blessing. "You hear anything from Sarah Collins?" Charlie asked. "Letter came last week. She's doing well in California, working as a teacher again. Says she's thinking about writing a book about her experiences." "Good for her. Woman like that deserves a chance at happiness." Jonas nodded, remembering Sarah's smile as the stage had carried her away from the ghosts of her past. He'd given her that chance, and in doing so, had found his own path back to purpose. They reached the end of Main Street, where the lights of town gave way to the vast darkness of the Montana prairie. Somewhere out there, other women might be fleeing their own versions of Thomas Collins. Other men might be struggling with choices between safety and justice. "Charlie," Jonas said suddenly, "you know this territory better than anyone. If someone needed to disappear, needed to start over somewhere safe, where would you send them?" Charlie's dark eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Depends on what they're running from, and how far they're willing to go to escape it. Let's say they're running from a man with money and influence. A man who doesn't like to lose what he considers his property. Then they'd need to go far indeed." Charlie was quiet for a moment, considering. "There are places, though, settlements where a person can disappear completely, start fresh with a new name and a new life, if they're desperate enough." Jonas filed the information away. He hoped he'd never need it, but experience had taught him that hope was a luxury law enforcement couldn't afford. "Thanks, Charlie. Good to know there are still options for folks who need them. Always, my friend. Always." As they parted ways, Jonas felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. Not the burden of his badge, but the responsibility that came with knowledge. He now knew things that could help desperate people, but also things that could destroy them if that knowledge fell into the wrong hands. Walking back toward his office, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that stormy night, when Sarah had appeared at his fence line. He'd been a broken man then, drowning in grief and whiskey, hiding from the world that had taken everything he loved. Now he was Sheriff Jonas McCready again, protector of the innocent, hunter of the guilty. But most importantly, he was a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage came not from facing down armed men in the street, but from opening your door to a stranger in need, regardless of the consequences. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the mountain air. Somewhere out there, other storms were brewing, other injustices taking root. But for now, Copper Falls was safe, and that was enough. Jonas Macready had found his purpose again, and he intended to keep it. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Copper Falls in snow that muffled sound and transformed familiar streets into something ethereal and strange. Jonas had grown comfortable in his role as sheriff, the rhythms of law enforcement coming back to him like muscle memory. The town was peaceful, prosperous even, as businesses grew bold enough to expand, now that Collins's shadow no longer fell across every transaction. It was during a particularly bitter February morning that the telegram arrived. Jonas was reviewing reports at his desk when Tommy Martinez, the telegraph operator, burst through the door with unusual urgency. "Sheriff," Tommy panted, his breath forming clouds in the cold office air. "Message came in from Denver, says it's urgent." Jonas took the yellow paper with a sense of foreboding. Experience had taught him that urgent telegrams rarely brought good news. "Sheriff Macready, stop. Thomas Collins escaped federal custody, stop. Believed headed your direction, stop. Extreme caution advised, stop. Us Marshal Peterson." The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. Collins had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a term that should have kept him safely locked away until he was too old to pose a threat. But somehow, the man had managed to escape. "Bad news, Sheriff?" Tommy asked, noting Jonas's grim expression. "Could be. Tommy, I need you to send a message to Marshal Peterson in Denver. Tell him I received his warning and ask for any additional information about Collins' escape." As Tommy hurried back to the telegraph office, Jonas began making preparations. Collins wouldn't come alone. He'd have help, and he'd be looking for revenge against everyone who'd played a role in his downfall. That meant Sarah was in danger, but also anyone in Copper Falls who'd cooperated with the federal investigation. The list was longer than Jonas liked to think about. Margaret Henley arrived at the office just as Jonas was checking his weapons. "Sheriff, there are strangers in town," she reported. 3 men just rode in from the south. They're asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "Your routine, your habits. The desk clerk at the hotel said they wanted to know when you usually made your rounds." Margaret's face was pale but determined. "I think they might be connected to Collins." Jonas felt ice form in his stomach. If Collins had sent advance men, it meant he was planning something more elaborate than a simple confrontation. The man was methodical, patient, dangerous qualities in an enemy. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me. Can you get word to Dr. Peterson, the banker Morrison, and Judge Williams? Tell them they might be in danger. Tell them to stay indoors and away from windows." "What about you? You're the primary target." Jonas strapped on his gun belt, checking that his Colt was loaded and ready. "I'll handle my own affairs, but I need to know the townspeople are safe." "There's something else," Margaret said. "One of the strangers was asking specifically about the old Collins Ranch. Wanted to know if anyone was living there now. The Collins Ranch had stood empty since Thomas's arrest, too tainted by its owner's reputation for anyone to want to purchase it. But if Collins was planning to use it as a base of operations, it gave Jonas some idea of his enemy's intentions. "How many men did you say?" "3 that I saw, but there could be more." Jonas nodded grimly. Collins had always preferred overwhelming odds when possible. 3 men suggested this was just the beginning. "Margaret, I want you to stay away from the hotel and anywhere those strangers might be. In fact, it might be best if you stayed home for the next few days." "I won't hide while you face danger alone," she said firmly. "If Collins is back, this concerns all of us." Before Jonas could argue, Charlie Two Horses appeared in the doorway. The scout's weathered face was troubled. "Jonas, we need to talk. Privately." Margaret excused herself, but not before extracting a promise from Jonas that he wouldn't face this threat alone. After she left, Charlie closed the door and took a seat across from the sheriff's desk. "Spotted riders on the North Ridge this morning," Charlie said without preamble. "At least 6 men, maybe more. They're watching the town." "Collins?" "Has to be. Nobody else has reason to scout Copper Falls like they're planning an attack." Charlie's dark eyes were grim. "This isn't going to be a simple gunfight, Jonas." "This is war." Jonas absorbed this information, his mind automatically shifting into tactical mode. Collins had superior numbers, and the advantage of choosing when and where to strike. But Jonas had something Collins didn't: intimate knowledge of the town and its people. "What's your recommendation, Charlie?" "Get out. Take what you can carry and ride for Denver. Let the federal marshals handle Collins when he shows himself. And leave the town defenseless." Jonas shook his head. "I won't do it. These people trusted me to protect them." "Dead men don't protect anybody," Charlie pointed out. "And Collins will kill you, Jonas. Him and his men. You know this." Jonas stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. A few townspeople moved about their business, unaware that death might be riding toward them. They deserved better than a sheriff who ran at the first sign of trouble. "I ran once before," Jonas said quietly. "After Martha died. Ran to my ranch and hid for 4 years while Collins terrorized this territory." He turned back to Charlie. "I won't run again." Charlie sighed deeply. "Then we fight. But we fight smart." "We? You think I'd let you face this alone?" Besides, Charlie's grin was wolfish. "I never did like bullies." They spent the next hour planning their defense of the town. Jonas knew every building, every alley, every potential position of cover or concealment. Charlie contributed his knowledge of the surrounding terrain and his expertise in guerrilla tactics, learned during years of warfare against hostile tribes. The plan they developed was necessarily simple. They couldn't predict exactly when or how Collins would strike, but they could make the town as difficult a target as possible. "First thing," Jonas said, sketching a rough map of Copper Falls, "we need to get the civilians out of the line of fire. The church basement should be safe enough. What about warning them? If we start moving people around, Collins's scouts will know we're preparing." Jonas considered this. "We tell them there's been a gas leak at the hotel. Dangerous fumes. Everyone needs to evacuate to the church until it can be fixed." It wasn't elegant, but it would work. Within 2 hours, most of Copper Falls's population had been relocated to the relative safety of St. Mary's basement, with Dr. Peterson and several other reliable men standing guard. Margaret had been among the most reluctant to take shelter. "This is my town too," she argued. "I have a right to defend it." "And I have a responsibility to keep you alive," Jonas replied firmly. "I need to know you're safe so I can focus on Collins." Eventually, she'd agreed to help coordinate the civilian evacuation, but Jonas could see the frustration in her eyes. She wasn't accustomed to being sidelined, and he respected her for it. By sunset, Copper Falls resembled a ghost town. Shutters were closed, streets empty. The only signs of life, the occasional glimpse of armed men moving between buildings. Jonas and Charlie had positioned themselves in the sheriff's office, which offered good sightlines down Main Street and easy access to the jail's arsenal. "How long do we wait?" Charlie asked, checking his rifle for the 3rd time. "Collins will come when he's ready. He's patient, methodical. He'll want to be sure of his advantage before he makes his move." They didn't have to wait long. The attack began at full dark, with muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions around the town's perimeter. Bullets shattered the office windows, sending glass cascading across the floor. Jonas and Charlie took cover behind the heavy oak desk, returning fire at the gun flashes. "Count," Jonas called out during a lull in the shooting. "At least 8 positions," Charlie replied. "Maybe 10. They've got us surrounded. The strategy was clear. Collins intended to pin them down in the office, then either burn them out or simply wait until their ammunition ran low. It was the kind of methodical approach Jonas had expected. "Time to move," Jonas said. "You remember the plan?" Charlie nodded. They'd prepared for this exact scenario, a fighting withdrawal to the church, where they could make their final stand with the civilians behind them as motivation to hold the line. They slipped out the back door of the office, using the network of alleys and side streets they'd mapped earlier. Behind them, Collins's men continued to pour fire into the empty building, unaware that their targets had already moved. The church sat on a small rise at the western edge of town, its stone construction offering better protection than the wooden buildings that comprised most of Copper Falls. Jonas and Charlie reached it without being detected, slipping inside to find the basement crowded with anxious townspeople. "Sheriff!" Margaret rose from where she'd been comforting a crying child. "What's happening out there?" "Collins is here, with at least 10 men. They've got the town surrounded, but they don't know you're all here yet." Jonas checked his ammunition. "We need to keep it that way." Dr. Peterson, gray-haired but steady-handed, approached with a shotgun cradled in his arms. "What do you need us to do?" "Stay quiet, stay down, and don't show any lights." "If they find you here..." Jonas didn't need to finish the sentence. A new sound reached them from outside, the crackling of flames. Through the small basement windows, they could see an orange glow beginning to spread across the town. "They're burning the buildings," Charlie observed grimly. "Trying to flush us out." Jonas felt a cold rage building in his chest. Collins wasn't just trying to kill him. He was destroying the entire town out of spite. The homes and businesses that people had spent years building were going up in smoke to satisfy one man's thirst for revenge. "I'm going out there," Jonas said, moving toward the stairs. "That's suicide," Margaret protested. "You'll be outnumbered 10-1. "Maybe. But I won't sit here and watch them burn down your town." Charlie stood as well. "We go together, old friend." "Like we planned." Jonas looked around the basement at the faces of the people he'd sworn to protect. Men, women, children, all depending on him to keep them safe. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but also clarifying. "If we don't come back," he said to Dr. Peterson, "barricade the doors and wait for the federal marshals. They'll come eventually." "They'll come sooner if we can signal them," Peterson replied, producing a small mirror from his medical bag. "Sun comes up in 6 hours. If you can keep Collins busy until then, I can flash a heliograph message to the army post at Fort Morrison." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. Jonas and Charlie checked their weapons one final time, then climbed the stairs to face whatever waited in the burning streets of Copper Falls. The town was indeed ablaze. At least 4 buildings were burning, their flames painting the snowy streets in flickering orange light. The sheriff's office was a total loss, as was Murphy's saloon and the general store. Smoke hung heavy in the air, making it difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction. "There!" Charlie pointed to a muzzle flash from behind an overturned wagon. "2 of them, maybe 3. Jonas nodded, indicating he'd seen them too. The plan was simple. Create enough chaos and confusion to keep Collins's men scattered and disorganized until dawn brought the possibility of rescue. They separated, Jonas moving east along the alley behind the bank, while Charlie circled north toward the livery stable. The idea was to hit Collins's men from multiple angles, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. The battle that followed was unlike anything Jonas had experienced during his lawman days. This wasn't a formal gunfight with rules and codes of honor. This was desperate, violent, and brutal. Men died in the shadows between buildings, their blood mixing with melting snow and ashes from the burning town. Jonas lost count of how many of Collins's men he'd killed or wounded. His world narrowed to the immediate necessities of survival, finding cover, acquiring targets, conserving ammunition. Time became fluid, minutes stretching into hours or compressing into heartbeats, depending on the intensity of each encounter. At some point during the night, he found himself face to face with Thomas Collins himself. The rancher had lost weight during his imprisonment, but none of his malevolent presence. He stood in the doorway of the burning hotel, backlit by flames, a revolver in each hand. "McCready," he called out, his voice carrying over the crackle of fire and the distant sound of gunshots. "Time to finish this." Jonas stepped into the street, his own Colt drawn and ready. Around them, the battle continued. Charlie's rifle barking from somewhere near the church. Return fire from Collins's remaining men scattered throughout the town. "Could have been easy," Collins said, slowly advancing down the hotel's front steps. "Could have minded your own business, lived out your days on that pathetic ranch of yours." "Could have," Jonas agreed, "but a man's got to sleep with his conscience." Collins laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Conscience? You destroyed my life, McCready. My business, my reputation, everything I built. You destroyed it yourself. I just made sure the law caught up with you." They were perhaps 20 feet apart now, well within killing range for both men. Jonas could see the madness in Collins's eyes, the desperate fury of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "Where is she?" Collins demanded suddenly. "Where's my wife?" Jonas realized Collins didn't know about Sarah's escape to California, didn't know she had built a new life far from his reach. Good. Let him waste time and energy searching for a woman who was already beyond his grasp. "Gone where you'll never find her," Jonas replied. Collins's face twisted with rage. "We'll see about that." The gunfight was swift and decisive. Both men drew simultaneously, but Jonas had one crucial advantage. He was fighting for something greater than revenge. He was fighting for justice, for the safety of innocent people, for the memory of all those Collins had hurt over the years. His bullet took Collins' center mass, dropping the man to his knees in the snow. Collins' shots went wide, his aim spoiled by the impact of Jonas's bullet. "Should have stayed in prison," Jonas said, standing over his dying enemy. Collins coughed, blood speckling the snow around him. Others will come. Men like me, always more." "Maybe," Jonas replied, "but there'll be men like me to stop them." Collins died as the first light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. Around the town, the sound of gunfire gradually ceased as his remaining men either fled or surrendered to Charlie and the armed townspeople who had emerged from the church basement. The cost had been high. 4 buildings were total losses, and 2 townspeople had been killed in the fighting, the blacksmith and one of the hotel clerks. But Copper Falls had survived, and Thomas Collins would never threaten anyone again. As the sun rose fully, painting the smoke-stained town in golden light, Jonas saw riders approaching from the east. Federal marshals, arriving too late to help, but in time to clean up the aftermath. Margaret appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Is it over?" she asked. Jonas looked around at the damage, at the townspeople emerging from their shelters to survey what remained of their community. Collins was dead, his men scattered or captured, but the scars would remain for years to come. "This part is," he said, "but there's always another Thomas Collins somewhere, another town that needs protecting. Will you stay? Help us rebuild?" Jonas considered the question, watching as Dr. Peterson organized medical aid for the wounded and Charlie directed the effort to contain the remaining fires. These people had shown remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They deserved a sheriff who would stand with them no matter what came. "As long as you'll have me," he replied. Margaret smiled through her tears. "That might be a very long time, Sheriff McCready." Jonas nodded, settling his hat more firmly on his head. The badge on his chest felt heavier than it had before, weighted with the responsibility of all those who depended on him for protection. But it was a burden he was finally ready to carry. The rebuilding of Copper Falls took the better part of a year. Jonas threw himself into the work with the same determination he'd once reserved for tracking outlaws across hostile territory. By day, he supervised construction crews and mediated disputes between contractors. By night, he walked the streets, ensuring that the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve remained unbroken. Margaret Henley proved invaluable during the reconstruction. Her organizational skills and natural leadership helped coordinate the efforts of dozens of volunteers. She also proved adept at managing the influx of new residents drawn to Copper Falls by its reputation as a town where the law was respected and corruption had no place to take root. "You've changed this place," she told Jonas one evening as they walked through the rebuilt town center. The new buildings were more substantial than their predecessors, constructed with an eye toward permanence rather than quick profit. "We all did," Jonas replied. "Couldn't have been done by one person alone." The federal government had provided compensation for the damages caused by Collins's final assault, but more importantly, they'd sent a message that communities willing to stand up to corruption would not be abandoned. 3 federal marshals now made their headquarters in Copper Falls, ensuring that no future Thomas Collins would find the territory easy pickings. Charlie Two Horses had been offered a permanent position as deputy sheriff, which he'd accepted with characteristic stoicism. His knowledge of the surrounding wilderness and his contacts among the various Indian tribes made him invaluable in preventing the kind of conflicts that had plagued other frontier communities. "Heard from California recently," Charlie mentioned during one of their evening patrols. "Letter came addressed to you, but I recognized the handwriting. Sarah Collins, now Sarah Mitchell, having taken her maiden name back, wrote regularly, keeping Jonas informed of her new life. She'd found work at a school for children of former slaves, teaching reading and mathematics to students whose hunger for education reminded her of her own desperate need for freedom during those dark months in Montana. The letter was lengthy, filled with details about her students and her work, but it was the final paragraph that struck Jonas most deeply. "I think of Montana often, and of the kindness you showed a desperate stranger. I've tried to pay that kindness forward in my own small way. Last month, a woman arrived here much as I arrived at your fence line, fleeing a husband who saw her as property rather than a person. I was able to help her find safety and a new beginning. She reminded me that the courage you showed that terrible night continues to ripple outward, touching lives we may never know about. Thank you, Jonas, for showing me that there are still good men in this world, willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Jonas folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. The validation meant more to him than he could express, even to himself. Winter arrived again, though this one seemed less harsh than the previous year. Perhaps it was because Copper Falls now had better buildings, better prepared against the Montana cold. Or perhaps it was because Jonas no longer faced the season alone, surrounded by friends and a community that had become his extended family. It was during a particularly quiet February evening that the next test arrived. Jonas was reviewing supply requests in his office when Tommy Martinez burst through the door with familiar urgency. "Sheriff, there's a woman outside. Says she needs to speak with you immediately. Says it's about Thomas Collins." Jonas felt his blood run cold. Collins was dead. He'd seen the man die with his own eyes, had watched them bury the body in the Copper Falls cemetery. But the name still had the power to send ice through his veins. "Where is she?" "On the porch. Wouldn't come inside. Says she's afraid of being seen." Jonas stepped outside to find a woman huddled in a worn traveling cloak, her face hidden in shadow. When she looked up, he was struck by her resemblance to someone he couldn't quite place. "Sheriff McCready?" Her voice was cultured, educated, with a slight southern accent. "My name is Rebecca Collins. I'm Thomas Collins' daughter." The revelation hit Jonas like a physical blow. Collins had never mentioned having children, though given his secretive nature, that wasn't necessarily surprising. "What do you want?" Jonas asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "To thank you," she replied, pulling back her hood to reveal a face that was indeed reminiscent of Thomas Collins, but softer, marked by intelligence rather than cruelty. "And to give you something that belongs to you." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small wooden box, which she held out to Jonas with steady hands. "I don't understand," Jonas said, making no move to take the box. "After my father's death, I inherited what remained of his estate. Most of it was seized by the federal government, of course, but there were some personal effects." She gestured to the box. "Including this, which he'd stolen from your wife's grave." Jonas's world tilted on its axis. What? My father was obsessed with the people he considered his enemies. He kept trophies, reminders of his victories over those who opposed him. Rebecca Collins' voice was steady, but Jonas could see the shame in her eyes. This locket belonged to your wife Martha. He had it dug up from her grave shortly after her death. With trembling hands, Jonas opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded silk, was Martha's gold locket, the one he'd buried with her, containing miniature portraits of both of them taken on their wedding day. He'd wondered why it hadn't been on her body when they'd found her after the fire, but in his grief, he hadn't pursued the question. "How do you know this belonged to her?" Jonas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was there when he showed it to Sarah, my stepmother. He told her it was a reminder of what happened to women who defied him." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "I was 17 then, old enough to understand the evil I was witnessing, but too young and too frightened to stop it." Jonas closed the box, holding it against his chest. "Why bring this to me now? Your father's been dead almost a year." "Because it never belonged to him, and because—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "Because I want you to know that not everyone who bore the Collins name was a monster. I've spent the last year trying to undo some of the damage he caused, using what little money remained to compensate his victims where possible. That's not your responsibility. Perhaps not legally, but morally?" Rebecca shook her head. "I benefited from his crimes for 23 years. I lived in luxury built on the suffering of others. The least I can do is try to make amends." Jonas studied her face, seeing something there that reminded him not of Thomas Collins, but of Sarah, a quiet strength forged in the crucible of survival. "What will you do now?" "There's a settlement in Oregon Territory that needs teachers. I'm qualified, and it's far enough from Montana that the Collins name won't follow me." She pulled her hood back up. "I just wanted to return what was stolen, and to tell you that what you did, stopping my father, protecting those women, it mattered. It saved lives." As she turned to leave, Jonas called out to her. "Miss Collins, if you ever need anything, if you're ever in trouble, you can find sanctuary here. What your father did isn't your sin to bear." She paused, looking back at him with eyes that held unshed tears. "Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know." After she disappeared into the night, Jonas remained on the porch, clutching Martha's locket. Inside, he could hear the familiar sounds of evening life in Copper Falls. Conversations from the saloon, the laughter of children, the everyday noises of a community at peace. Margaret found him there an hour later, still holding the small wooden box. "Jonas? What's wrong?" He told her about Rebecca Collins's visit, about the locket and what it represented. As he spoke, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle that had been left open for too long was finally closing. "Will you wear it again?" Margaret asked gently. Jonas considered the question. For years after Martha's death, he'd tortured himself with memories of their life together, using his grief as both shield and prison. But now he understood that love wasn't diminished by loss, any more than courage was diminished by fear. Martha's memory didn't need to be preserved in amber. It could live and breathe and inspire him to be the man she'd always believed him to be. "Yes," he said, fastening the chain around his neck. The locket settled against his heart, where it belonged. "But not as a reminder of what I lost. As a reminder of what I found." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and revealing the new growth that had taken root during the winter months. Copper Falls bustled with activity as merchants prepared for the increased traffic that came with warmer weather. The town had gained a reputation as a safe stopping point for travelers heading west, and prosperity followed in the wake of that reputation. Jonas found himself busier than ever, but it was a good kind of busy, the work of a peace officer in a lawful community, rather than a warrior fighting corruption and violence. He mediated property disputes, investigated the occasional theft, and kept an eye on the various characters who drifted through town with the spring migration. It was during one such routine patrol that he encountered a familiar figure. "Well, I'll be damned," said a voice from the shadows of the Mercantile. "Jonas Macready, wearing a badge again." Jonas turned to see a man in his 50s step into the lamplight, lean, grizzled, with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life on the wrong side of the law, but had never quite crossed the line into true villainy. "Jake Morrison," Jonas said, recognizing the former outlaw. "Thought you'd retired to California." "Did for a while, but retirement don't suit me." Jake grinned, showing teeth stained by tobacco. "Heard interesting stories about this town. About a sheriff who took on Thomas Collins and lived to tell about it. Collins is dead and buried. His kind of trouble won't be tolerated here." "Oh, I ain't looking for trouble, Jonas." "Quite the opposite." Jake reached slowly into his coat, producing a folded piece of paper. "Got a proposition for you." Jonas examined the document. A federal warrant for the arrest of one William Black Bill Anderson, wanted for bank robbery, murder, and various other crimes across 3 territories. "What's this got to do with me?" "Anderson's holed up about 50 miles north of here, in the old mining camp at Devil's Canyon. Been there for weeks, thinking he's safe because it's outside your jurisdiction." Jake's eyes glittered with anticipation. "But see, there's a federal bounty on his head. $5,000, dead or alive." Jonas handed back the warrant. "I'm not a bounty hunter anymore, Jake. Haven't been for years." "Maybe not, but you're still the best tracker and fastest gun in the territory. And Anderson ain't just any outlaw. He's the kind that makes Thomas Collins look like a choir boy. Killed a family in Colorado just because they recognized him from a wanted poster." The description gave Jonas pause. He'd heard stories about Black Bill Anderson, a man who seemed to kill for the simple pleasure of it, who left a trail of innocent victims across the frontier. Why bring this to me? There are plenty of bounty hunters who'd take this job. "Because they'd all end up dead," Jake said bluntly. "Anderson's got at least 6 men with him, all hardened killers. It would take someone with your skills and reputation to bring him in." Jonas considered the proposal. Copper Falls was peaceful now, well protected by the federal marshals who'd made it their headquarters. Charlie could handle day-to-day law enforcement while he was gone, and if Anderson was truly as dangerous as Jake claimed. "What's your stake in this?" Jonas asked. Jake's expression grew serious. "Anderson killed my nephew in Kansas. Boy was only 19, working as a bank clerk. Anderson shot him in cold blood during a robbery, even though the kid was cooperating." His voice hardened. "I want justice, Jonas. But more than that, I want Anderson stopped before he kills more innocents." The personal motivation rang true. Jonas had learned to read men's faces over his years in law enforcement, and Jake's grief was genuine. "I'll need supplies, horses, provisions for a week at least." Jake's weathered face broke into a grin. "Already taken care of. When do we leave?" "We? You don't think I'd miss this, do you? I may be getting old, but I can still shoot straight, and I know the country around Devil's Canyon better than anyone." Jonas found himself smiling despite his reservations. There was something appealing about the idea of one final hunt, one last chance to bring a truly dangerous criminal to justice before settling fully into the role of small-town sheriff. Dawn tomorrow, he decided. And Jake? This is a federal arrest, not a revenge killing. Anderson goes back alive, if at all possible. Understood, Sheriff. Though if he draws on us, we defend ourselves. But we do this by the law. That evening, Jonas made his preparations and said his goodbyes. Margaret was worried, but understanding. Charlie was confident he could handle the town's needs in Jonas's absence, and the federal marshals promised to keep an extra eye on Copper Falls while their local colleague was away. As Jonas packed his saddlebags, he found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a broken hermit, drowning his sorrows in whiskey and isolation. Now he was preparing to track down one of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. backed by the full authority of federal law. Martha's locket rested against his chest as he worked, a reminder not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd found. Purpose, community, the satisfaction of work worth doing. The hunt for Black Bill Anderson took 4 days. Jake proved as good as his word, guiding them through mountain passes and hidden valleys with the expertise of a man who'd spent decades evading the law in the same territory. They found Anderson's camp exactly where Jake had said it would be, nestled in a box canyon with only one way in or out. The arrest went smoother than Jonas had expected. Surrounded and outnumbered, Anderson's men surrendered rather than face a shootout they couldn't win. Anderson himself proved to be a disappointed-looking man in his 40s, whose reputation far exceeded his physical presence. "You're Jonas McCready," Anderson said as Jonas fastened the shackles around his wrists. "Heard stories about you. Heard you was dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Jonas replied, "as were reports of your intelligence, apparently. Hiding in a box canyon with only one way out?" Anderson shrugged. "Seemed safe enough. Nobody's bothered us for weeks. Until now." The return journey to Copper Falls was uneventful. Anderson and his men seemed resigned to their fate, perhaps relieved that they'd been captured by someone with a reputation for bringing prisoners back alive. The federal bounty would be split between Jonas and Jake, though Jonas had already decided to donate his portion to the fund for rebuilding the town's school. As they crested the final ridge before Copper Falls came into view, Jonas felt a familiar sense of homecoming. The town spread out below them, peaceful and prosperous, smoke rising from chimneys and children playing in the streets. "Pretty little place," Anderson commented. "Shame it won't last. Towns like this never do on the frontier." "This one will," Jonas replied with certainty. "This one's got something worth fighting for." As they rode into Copper Falls, Jonas realized that his life had come full circle. He'd started as a young lawman full of idealism and certainty, had been broken by loss and disillusionment, and had finally found his way back to purpose and hope. The stranger who'd appeared at his fence line that terrible night had given him more than he'd given her. She'd reminded him that some things were worth the risk, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Margaret was waiting on the porch of the sheriff's office as they rode up, her face bright with relief and welcome. Charlie emerged from the jail with a set of keys, ready to process the new prisoners. The federal marshals appeared to take custody of Anderson and arrange for his transport to Denver for trial. As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Copper Falls, Jonas McCready stood in the doorway of his office and surveyed his domain. A year and a half ago, he'd been a broken man hiding from the world. Now he was exactly where he belonged, a guardian standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. Martha's locket caught the evening light as he moved, and for a moment he could almost feel her presence beside him, proud of the man he'd become and the promises he'd kept. Some circles, Jonas reflected, took years to close. But when they finally did, they revealed not endings, but new beginnings, not conclusions, but the hope of stories yet to be told. The stranger at Devil's Creek had changed his life in ways he was still discovering. But perhaps more importantly, he'd changed hers, and through her, the lives of countless others who would benefit from the courage and compassion that rippled outward from a single act of kindness on a cold Montana night. Justice, Jonas had learned, was not a destination, but a journey, and he was finally ready for whatever lay ahead on the trail.